What is the price of silence? We often tell ourselves that monsters are outsiders, drifters hiding in the woods, or shadows lurking in dark alleys. We want to believe that evil is something that must break into our world from the outside. But the most terrifying truth of the human condition is that, sometimes, the darkness is born right within the walls we call a sanctuary. It grows in the bedroom next to ours, eats at our dinner table, and says good night, with a smile that hides 1,000 sharpened blades. In the quiet suburbia of Middle America, there is a myth we all subscribe to. The myth of the quiet neighbor. We see a large house with a manicured lawn, hear the distant sound of children's laughter, and assume that safety is a permanent resident. But in the summer of 2015, in a town called Broken Arrow, that myth didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000,000 bloody pieces. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This isn't just a story about a crime. It is a descent into the minds of two brothers who decided that infamy was worth more than the lives of those who gave them breath. Robert and Michael Bever didn't want money, and they didn't want revenge for a specific wrong. They wanted to become legends of the macabre. They wanted to be the first names on a list of the world's most prolific killers. And to start their grand tour of slaughter, they chose the only people who truly knew them. To understand the horror that unfolded on July 22, 2015, we have to look at the town itself. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, is the kind of place people move to when they want to escape the chaos of the big city. It's a community built on traditional values, where the grass is always green and the crime rate is a distant afterthought. On the quiet cul-de-sac of Magnolia Court, the Bever family lived in a massive 2-story brick home that spanned over 3,000 square feet. To any passerby, it was the literal embodiment of the American dream. The head of the household was David Bever, a 52-year-old computer scientist. David was a man of intellect, a tech-savvy provider who spent his days working to ensure his large family wanted for nothing. His wife, 44-year-old April, was the heart of the home. Together, they had 7 children, ranging from a tiny infant to the 18-year-old Robert. But there was a peculiar atmosphere surrounding the Bever residence. While other children in the neighborhood played in the streets or attended the local high school, the Bever children were almost never seen. David and April were extremely protective. Some would say reclusive. All 7 children were homeschooled. They didn't have Facebook accounts. They didn't go to prom. They didn't even have friends in the traditional sense. The walls of that 3,000-square-foot house weren't just a shelter, they were a fortress. The parents sought to shield their brood from what they perceived as the poison of the outside world. But in their attempt to keep the world out, they inadvertently trapped a different kind of poison inside. Robert Bever, the eldest brother, was the architect of the family's isolation. At 18, Robert was a young man who seemed to exist entirely within his own head. He was thin, with a pale complexion that suggested he rarely saw the Oklahoma sun. While his father worked with computers to build a future, Robert used his laptop to explore the darkest corners of human history. He became obsessed with mass shooters, specifically the perpetrators of the Columbine High School massacre. He didn't see them as villains. He saw them as pioneers. His younger brother, 16-year-old Michael, was his shadow. In the dynamic of the Bever brothers, Robert was the leader, the philosopher of death, and Michael was the eager disciple. They shared a bedroom that became a laboratory for their twisted ambitions. While their parents thought they were upstairs studying their lessons, the boys were actually tracking the arrival of packages. Using money earned from a part-time job at a local IT company, Robert began stockpiling. It started small, a few survival knives, a tactical vest. But soon, the bedroom closet was filled with a terrifying arsenal. Kabar knives, hatchets, daggers, and over 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Robert's plan was meticulously documented in a series of journals. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to outdo everyone who came before him. He spoke of a strike that would begin in Broken Arrow and move across the country, targeting random locations to achieve a body count of at least 50 people. He wanted to be famous. He wanted people to look at his face and feel the kind of cold, paralyzing fear that he felt for a world he didn't belong to. The brothers even had a nickname for their impending mission, the Startup. They viewed their family not as people, but as the first test subjects for their equipment. They practiced their movements in the dark, learning how to move silently through the hallways of their own home. They even planned to build armies of robots, equipped with blades to help them increase the efficiency of their massacres. It sounds like the plot of a low-budget horror movie, but for Robert and Michael, it was a business plan. As July 2015 approached, the tension inside the house was invisible to the neighbors. David and April continued their routine, unaware that the two boys they had raised in total isolation were now viewing them as obstacles to be removed. Robert would later say that he felt nothing for his parents, no hatred, but also no love. They were merely the first characters in a script he had written in blood. The sun set on July 22nd like any other day in Oklahoma. The temperature was a humid 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cicadas were buzzing in the trees surrounding Magnolia Court. Inside the house, the younger siblings were getting ready for bed. The youngest, a 2-year-old girl, was already asleep. Crystal, 13, and Victoria, 7, were in their rooms. Christopher, 10, and Daniel, 7, were likely playing quietly. They had no idea that in the room upstairs, Robert and Michael were putting on their tactical gear. They were sharpening their knives. They were checking the straps on their body armor. The quiet neighbor was about to become the site of the most gruesome crime in the history of the state, and the silence of Magnolia Court was about to be broken forever. To the outside world, the Bever home was a fortress of silence, but inside, it was a pressure cooker of escalating madness. To understand how two teenagers could contemplate the annihilation of their own blood, we have to look at the hierarchy established between the brothers. Robert Bever, at 18, was the undisputed master of this dark domain. He wasn't just Michael's older brother, he was his mentor, his king, and his god. Robert possessed a chillingly articulate way of speaking, a byproduct of years of isolation, and a diet of extremist internet forums and true crime manifestos. He didn't just hate his life, he viewed himself as a superior being trapped in a mundane reality. He had convinced 16-year-old Michael that they were the enlightened ones. In Robert's twisted philosophy, the rest of the world, including their parents and siblings, were merely background characters. They were non-player characters in a simulation that Robert intended to win. Their relationship was built on a foundation of shared secrets. While their 5 younger siblings were kept on a strict schedule of chores and homeschooling, Robert and Michael were crafting a legacy of blood. They spent hours in their shared bedroom, the door locked, discussing the startup. This wasn't a business venture. It was a blueprint for a cross-country massacre. Robert had a specific vision. He told Michael that they wouldn't just be killers, they would be legends. He spoke of acquiring body armor, building an army of robots, equipped with blades to maximize efficiency, and eventually heading to a major city to commit a shooting that would dwarf the tragedies of the past. But for the startup to begin, they needed capital, and they needed to eliminate the only people who might notice they were missing. Their family became, in their minds, the first test subjects. They began to view their parents, David and April, not as protectors, but as obstacles. Robert would later describe his parents as hateful and controlling, yet he could never point to specific instances of abuse. It seemed their primary sin was simply existing within the same 4 walls as Robert's grand ambitions. The brothers spent months preparing. Using the money Robert earned from a part-time job, they began ordering equipment online. It arrived in packages that the parents never bothered to inspect. Inside were tactical vests, heavy-duty belts, and a collection of blades that looked like something out of a medieval nightmare. They had knives designed for gutting, daggers for stabbing, and hatchets for the heavy work. They even practiced. In the dead of night, while the house was silent, Robert and Michael would move through the hallways in their full tactical gear. They learned every creak in the floorboards. They timed how long it took to get from one bedroom to the next. They were athletes training for a sport where the only prize was death. There was a profound, slow burn to their descent. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a calculated, cold-blooded progression. Robert would watch his younger siblings play, the 7-year-old Daniel, the 10-year-old Christopher, and he didn't see brothers. He saw targets. He saw points on a leaderboard. Michael, however, showed occasional flickers of doubt. In later interviews, he would admit that he didn't really want to die, and he didn't necessarily want to kill. But the pull of Robert's personality was like a gravity well. He was terrified of being left behind. He was terrified of being ordinary. Robert had promised him a place in history, and Michael was willing to pay the price in blood to stay by his brother's side. By mid-July 2015, the preparation was complete. They had the gear, they had the weapons, and they had the date. The atmosphere in the house on those final days must have been surreal. Imagine sitting at the dinner table, passing the salt to a mother who is worried about your education, while in your pocket, you are clutching a schedule for her execution. Robert and Michael played their roles perfectly. They were the quiet boys. They were the good sons. But the startup was no longer a fantasy. The gear was packed. The knives were sharpened to a razor's edge. The brothers had even planned to record their mission on a GoPro camera to ensure their infamy was documented for the world to see. As the sun began to set on July 22, 2015, the temperature in Broken Arrow hovered around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of Oklahoma humidity that sticks to your skin. Inside the house on Magnolia Court, the Bever family was settling in for the night. They thought they were safe behind their locked doors and high fences. They had no idea that the monsters weren't outside. The monsters were upstairs, tightening their bootlaces and checking the blades of their hatchets, waiting for the clock to strike 12. The night of July 22, 2015, felt heavy. The temperature had barely dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air inside the house on Magnolia Court was thick with the scent of a regular family evening. Faint traces of dinner, laundry detergent, and the silence of a home settling into sleep. But in the upstairs bedroom, the air was different. It was charged with the metallic tang of sharpened steel and the frantic, shallow breathing of two boys who were about to step out of their lives and into a nightmare. It was approximately 11:30 p.m. Robert and Michael didn't just wake up and decide to do this. They had dressed with the precision of soldiers. Tactical vests tightened over their chests, heavy work boots laced to the top, knife sheaths strapped to their legs. They looked like something out of a video game, a grotesque parody of the elite warriors Robert admired so much. The plan was simple. They would lure their siblings one by one, eliminate them quietly, and then move on to their parents. They wanted to keep the chaos to a minimum to ensure they could finish the entire startup before the police could even be notified. The first target was their 13-year-old sister, Crystal. Crystal was a sweet girl, someone who trusted her older brothers. When they called her into their bedroom, claiming they had something important to show her on the computer screen, she didn't hesitate. She walked into the room, likely expecting a joke or a video. Instead, she was met with a flash of cold steel. The brothers attacked her with a ferocity that defied logic. But Crystal wasn't a background character. She fought, she screamed, and in that moment, the silent plan Robert had spent months crafting evaporated. The screams tore through the quiet of the house. April Bever, hearing her daughter's cries, did what any mother would do. She ran toward the sound. She didn't call the police. She didn't grab a weapon. She ran to protect her child. As she reached the doorway, she was met not by her sons, but by two masked figures who no longer recognized her as their mother. Robert and Michael fell upon her in the hallway. It was a chaotic, brutal struggle. April was a small woman, but she fought with the desperation of a lioness. The brothers used multiple knives, stabbing her dozens of times. The carpet, once a neutral beige, was quickly stained a deep, permanent crimson. Downstairs, David Bever heard the commotion. He was a man of logic and tech, perhaps thinking it was a fall or a frantic argument. He ran up the stairs only to be met by his eldest son, Robert, wielding a hatchet and a knife. David was 52 years old, a strong man, but he was caught completely off guard. He died in the hallway, trying to reach his wife and daughter. The audio from that call is one of the most haunting artifacts in the history of Oklahoma crime. You can hear Daniel's voice, trembling, whispering, telling the dispatcher, "My brother is attacking my family." In the background, There is the sound of doors being kicked in, the heavy thud of boots, and then the chilling voice of one of the brothers, pretending to be a victim, trying to trick Daniel into opening the door. "Help me, Daniel, I'm hurt, open the door!" But Daniel didn't open it. He knew. He stayed on the line until the very end, until the sound of the door splintering echoed through the phone. Then the line went quiet. Robert and Michael moved through the house like ghosts with blades. They found 10-year-old Christopher and 7-year-old Daniel. They found 5-year-old Victoria. One by one, the test subjects were eliminated. The sheer number of wounds on the victims, some stabbed more than 20 or 30 times, showed a level of overkill that pointed to a profound, sickening detachment from reality. Yet, in the middle of this whirlpool of blood, a miracle occurred. Crystal, despite her horrific injuries, had managed to crawl away and hide, and the youngest child, the 2-year-old baby girl, was left untouched in her crib. Perhaps the brothers ran out of time, or perhaps even in their blackened hearts, there was a sliver of something they couldn't name that stayed their hands. When the first police officers arrived at Magnolia Court, the house was eerily dark. There were no lights on, no sirens yet. But as they stepped onto the porch, they saw the blood on the door handle. They heard a faint, rhythmic sound from inside, the sound of an alarm clock that no one would ever turn off. The brothers didn't stay to fight the police. They had a bug-out bag ready. They slipped out the back door and disappeared into the thick, wooded area behind the neighborhood, leaving behind a house that had been transformed from a family home into a monument of human depravity. When the officers finally breached the door, they were seasoned veterans, men who had seen car accidents and shootings. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for what was inside. They found David first, then April, then the children. The officers would later describe the scene as a sea of red. One officer noted that the smell of copper was so thick it felt like he was swallowing it, but the monsters were gone. Somewhere in the dark Oklahoma woods, Robert and Michael were listening to the sirens, thinking they had finally become the legends they always dreamed of being. But as the two officers stepped onto the porch of the Bever residence, the silence of the cul-de-sac felt wrong. It wasn't the silence of a sleeping neighborhood. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. One officer reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. As the door swung open, the smell hit them, a thick metallic stench that seemed to coat the back of their throats. It was the smell of over 3 gallons of fresh blood cooling in the Oklahoma humidity. They didn't find a family in the middle of a fight. They found a slaughterhouse. In the dim light of their tactical flashlights, the hallway looked like a scene from a war zone. They found the bodies of David and April first. The carnage was so absolute that it was difficult, even for seasoned professionals, to process what they were seeing. But then, a sound, a faint, wet wheeze coming from the darkness of the kitchen. There, lying in a pool of crimson, was 13-year-old Crystal. She had been stabbed in the neck, her torso, her arms. She was fading, her eyes glazed with shock, but she was alive. As the officers knelt beside her, she managed to whisper the most terrifying words they would hear that night. "My brothers, they did this." The realization was a physical blow. This wasn't an outside intruder. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The monsters were still in the house, or they had just left. As more units arrived, the scene became a frantic, organized chaos. Paramedics rushed Crystal to a waiting helicopter to fly her to a trauma center 20 miles away. Inside, another officer found the 2-year-old baby, Autumn, miraculously unharmed in her crib, her wide eyes staring at the flashlight beams, unaware that her entire world had been annihilated in the rooms next to her. But the killers were gone. The search didn't take days. It took minutes, but those minutes felt like hours for the men and women standing in that house of horrors. A K9 unit was brought to the back of the property. The dog, a Belgian Malinois trained to track human scent, immediately caught a trail leading toward the thick, wooded area that buffered the neighborhood. The woods were a tangled mess of undergrowth and oak trees. The officers moved in a line, their weapons drawn, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They knew they were looking for 2 teenagers, but after seeing the house, they knew they were hunting predators. Less than 200 yards into the tree line, The dog began to bay. The flashlight beams cut through the brush, and there they were. Robert and Michael Bever were sitting on the damp earth, surrounded by the suburban woods they had played in as children. But they didn't look like children anymore. They were still wearing their tactical gear, the black vests, the heavy boots, the belts laden with empty knife sheaths. The contrast was staggering. Their clothes were saturated with blood, the blood of their parents, the blood of their siblings. It was matted in their hair and smeared across their pale faces. "Get down! Hands behind your head!" The brothers didn't fight. They didn't scream. Robert, the mastermind, simply looked up into the blinding light of the police flashlights and smiled. It wasn't a smirk of defiance. It was the chillingly calm expression of a man who had just completed a long day of work. Michael followed his brother's lead, surrendering with a quiet, almost submissive demeanor. As they were led out of the woods in handcuffs, the neighborhood was finally waking up. Neighbors stood on their porches in pajamas, watching as the two quiet boys were loaded into separate patrol cars. They saw the blood on the boys' clothes and the sheer number of ambulances lined up on the street. By the time the sun began to rise over Broken Arrow, the temperature climbing back toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the news had already begun to spread. This wasn't just a murder. It was the collapse of a family from within. The fortress on Magnolia Court was now a crime scene, wrapped in yellow tape, its windows dark and hollow. The search was over, but for the investigators, the true nightmare was just beginning, because now they had to ask why. And as they sat Robert and Michael down in separate interrogation rooms, they realized that the answers were far more disturbing than the crime itself. In one room sat 18-year-old Robert Bever. He was still dressed in the blood-soaked tactical gear he had been captured in, the black nylon vest, the heavy boots, the dark cargo pants. He didn't look like a prisoner. He didn't look like a boy who had just lost his entire family. He sat in the metal chair with a posture that was almost regal. His hands, still stained with a dark, dried crust under his fingernails, rested calmly on the table. When the detectives entered, they expected tears. They expected a frantic confession or a wall of defensive silence. What they got instead was a lecture. Robert spoke with a chilling clinical precision. He didn't avoid the details. He leaned into them. He described the startup as if it were a legitimate business venture that had simply run into a few technical difficulties. He told the investigators that his parents and siblings were just the beginning, a warm-up for a much larger mission. His goal, he stated without a tremor in his voice, was to become a famous serial killer. He wanted his name to be whispered alongside the likes of the Columbine shooters or the most prolific monsters in history. "I wanted to kill at least 50 people, he told the lead detective. "We were going to move from town to town. We were going to hit movie theaters, shopping malls, anywhere with a high density of people. We had the gear. We were just getting started." The detectives watched him through the two-way mirror, their stomachs churning. Robert wasn't just admitting to the crime, he was boasting about it. He talked about the efficiency of his knives and how he had researched the human anatomy to ensure his strikes were lethal. He even giggled, a high-pitched, childish sound, when describing how he had tricked his younger siblings into opening their doors. To Robert, the screams of his family weren't a tragedy. They were feedback on his performance. Michael began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse for his parents. They were tears of fear for himself. He described the influence Robert had over him, how his older brother was the mastermind, and he was just following orders. Yet, when asked about the specific moments in the house, the kicking in of doors, the pursuit of his fleeing sisters, Michael couldn't deny his active participation. He was the one who had helped lure the children. He was the one who had stood by while Robert swung the hatchet. While the brothers were being questioned, a separate team of forensic investigators was back at the house on Magnolia Court, executing a search warrant that would reveal the true depth of the brothers' obsession. Inside the brothers' shared bedroom, they found the command center. On Robert's computer were thousands of files, detailed logs of weapon orders, maps of potential targets across the state, and a digital manifesto that outlined his philosophy of natural selection. He believed that by killing, he was ascending to a higher state of being. But the most damning evidence was the physical journal. In neat, almost elegant handwriting, Robert had documented the startup from its inception. He wrote about his armies of robots, plans to build automated killing machines that could be deployed into crowds. He had sketches of the tactical gear they would wear and a kill list that started with his family and ended with names of celebrities and politicians. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a GoPro camera and several spare batteries. The brothers hadn't just planned to kill their family, they had intended to film the entire massacre. They wanted the world to see the startup in high definition. They wanted the footage to serve as a recruitment tool for like-minded individuals. As the sun rose over Broken Arrow, the detectives realized they weren't dealing with a snap or a fit of rage. They were dealing with a calculated long-term project of annihilation. Robert Bever had spent years curating a world of darkness within the walls of that house, and Michael had been his most devoted student. "He's not a human being," one detective whispered as he watched Robert on the monitor, still smiling, still talking about the splatter patterns he had observed. "He's something else, entirely." The investigation was closing the circle, but the weight of the evidence was almost too much for the community to bear. The quiet boys were gone, replaced by the reality of two predators who had turned their own home into a testing ground for mass murder. Robert Bever did not want a trial. In his mind, a trial was a stage he no longer needed. He had already achieved his masterpiece. In 2016, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to kill. He didn't blink as the judge handed down 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Robert, this was simply the final chapter of his book. He was led away to a maximum security facility, destined to spend the next 50 or 60 years in a concrete box, a living ghost of his own ambition. But Michael Bever's path was more contentious. Because he was only 16 at the time of the murders, the law viewed him through a different lens. His defense team argued that he was a victim of his brother's extreme manipulation, a child groomed for slaughter by the only person he ever trusted. They painted a picture of a boy who was too weak to say no to a god. And what of the fortress on Magnolia Court? For months after the crime, the house stood as a grim tourist attraction. Drifters would park their cars across the street, staring at the brick walls, trying to catch a glimpse of the House of Horrors. The neighbors, the people who just wanted to forget the screams and the blue lights, couldn't take it. The house was a wound that wouldn't heal. In 2017, the city of Broken Arrow made a decision. They didn't sell the house. They didn't renovate it. They demolished it. Every brick, every floorboard that had soaked up the Bever family's blood was ground into dust and hauled away. In its place, they built Reflection Park. Today, it is a quiet green space with a gazebo and a winding path. There are no plaques mentioning the murders. There are no monuments to Robert and Michael. There is only the wind in the trees and the silence, a different kind of silence this time. A silence meant for peace, not for secrets. Robert and Michael weren't born in a gutter. They weren't raised by strangers. They were raised in a 3,000-square-foot home by parents who thought they were doing the right thing by keeping the poison of the world away from their children. But they forgot that isolation is its own kind of poison. In the absence of the world, Robert created his own. A world where life had no value, and infamy was the only currency worth collecting. Crystal and Autumn, the 2 survivors, are the living legacy of that night. One carries the scars of the blades, the other carries a void where a family should have been. They are the only ones who truly know what was lost in the startup. As you walk through Reflection Park today, it's easy to forget what happened on that spot. The grass is green, and the Oklahoma sun is warm. But if you listen closely to the rustle of the leaves, you realize that some stories never truly end. They just change shape. The Bever brothers wanted to be legends, but they ended up as a cautionary tale about the darkness that grows when we stop looking at each other. In the end, Robert and Michael didn't become icons. They became a footnote in a history of grief, and the only thing that remains of their grand mission is a quiet park where people go to remember and to hope that the silence stays peaceful this time. Stay vigilant, because the most dangerous monsters are the ones who share your last name. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.